Welcome to the Lost Method, where history is explained through the systems that shaped it. In September 1938, the leaders of Britain and France returned home from Munich to cheering crowds. They believed they had prevented a Second World War. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stood before reporters, holding a piece of paper signed by Adolf Hitler, and declared that it meant peace for our time. Less than a year later, Europe was at war. Appeasement is often remembered as naive, cowardly, or foolish, but that explanation is too simple and dangerously misleading. Appeasement did not fail because European leaders were stupid. It failed because they misunderstood power, incentives, and the nature of Hitler's aims. To understand why appeasement failed, we first need to understand why it was adopted, and why, for a time, it seemed like the rational choice. The First World War left Europe physically destroyed and psychologically scarred. Entire generations had been lost. Cities lay in ruins. National economies were exhausted. In Britain and France, the trauma of the war shaped politics for decades. There was no appetite for another conflict, not among politicians, and certainly not among the public. War was no longer seen as a test of national honor. It was seen as a catastrophic failure of civilization. This mattered deeply. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, European leaders were not asking, "How do we confront him?" They were asking, "How do we avoid war at almost any cost?" Appeasement was not a single decision. It was a strategy shaped by multiple pressures. First, there was military weakness. Britain was not ready for war in the 1930s. Its army was small. Its air defenses were underdeveloped. France, despite having a large army, relied heavily on defensive planning and was politically divided. Second, there was economic reality. The Great Depression had devastated European economies. Unemployment was high. Public spending was constrained. Another major war threatened financial collapse. Third, there was the Treaty of Versailles. Many British and French politicians believed that Germany had been treated unfairly after World War I. Territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations were seen as excessive. When Hitler demanded revisions to Versailles, some of his demands appeared, at least superficially, reasonable. This created a dangerous assumption that Hitler was a traditional nationalist, not a revolutionary expansionist. One of appeasement's greatest failures was misinterpretation. British and French leaders assumed Hitler behaved like other European statesmen, aggressive perhaps, but ultimately rational. They believed that if Germany's grievances were addressed, stability would return. Hitler encouraged this belief. He spoke the language of self-determination. He claimed to seek peace. He framed his actions as defensive corrections to past injustices. But Hitler's worldview was fundamentally different. For him, foreign policy was not about balance or compromise. It was about expansion, domination, and racial hierarchy. Appeasement failed because it treated Hitler as a negotiator when he was, in fact, a gambler. Germany's rearmament was the earliest warning sign. The Treaty of Versailles strictly limited German military strength. Yet within years of taking power, Hitler openly violated these restrictions. Britain and France protested, but did nothing. Why? Because enforcing Versailles meant war, and war, they believed, would be worse than violation. This response taught Hitler a crucial lesson. The risks of defiance were low. Each unchallenged violation made the next one easier. Appeasement did not calm Hitler. It emboldened him. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone protected by international treaty. This was a major escalation. German generals privately feared intervention. Hitler later admitted that if France had acted, Germany would have been forced to retreat. But Britain and France did nothing. This was the turning point. Appeasement could still have worked, but only if it had been backed by force. Instead, restraint was interpreted as weakness. From this moment on, Hitler became convinced that Britain and France would always back down. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Once again, there was no military response. For many observers, this seemed like a natural union of German-speaking peoples. But strategically, it transformed Germany's position in Europe. It increased manpower, it strengthened industry, and it brought Germany closer to Eastern Europe. Appeasement had now crossed a critical line. It was no longer about correcting Versailles. It was about allowing expansion. The Munich Agreement marked the high point of appeasement. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. Czechoslovakia was a functioning democracy. It had a strong army. It had defensive alliances. Yet Britain and France pressured it to surrender territory without its consent. Why? Because leaders believed this concession would be the last. They believed Hitler's ambitions were limited. They were wrong. By sacrificing Czechoslovakia, appeasement destroyed credibility and deterrence simultaneously. Hitler gained territory, resources, and confidence without firing a shot. Appeasement failed not because leaders wanted peace, but because the strategy was flawed. First, it removed consequences. Each concession rewarded aggression. Second, it undermined alliances. Countries that might have resisted Hitler lost faith in British and French support. Third, it shifted initiative entirely to Germany. Hitler set the pace. Others reacted. Appeasement turned foreign policy into crisis management rather than strategy. In March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. This act shattered the logic of appeasement. It was no longer possible to claim that Hitler only sought German unity. Britain and France finally recognized that war was unavoidable. But by then, Germany was far stronger and Europe far weaker than it had been years earlier. Appeasement had not prevented war. It had postponed it and made it worse. Appeasement is often remembered as a moral failure. In reality, it was a strategic failure. It misunderstood the nature of the threat. It treated ideology as negotiable, and it assumed that restraint would be reciprocated. History shows that appeasement works only when the opposing power is limited and cautious. Hitler was neither. Appeasement failed against Hitler because it was based on the wrong assumptions. It assumed that peace could be preserved through compromise alone. It assumed that aggression had limits, and it assumed that delay would buy safety. Instead, delay brought danger. Appeasement did not fail because leaders feared war. It failed because they feared it more than they understood it. And by the time they were ready to confront Hitler, the cost of doing so had multiplied. So the real question is not whether appeasement was well-intentioned. It is whether avoiding confrontation can ever succeed when the other side has already decided that war is inevitable.